The year isn't over, but for these death row inmates, time is. In 2025, America is not only executing more prisoners than it has in nearly a decade, it's bringing back methods most thought were buried in the past. Firing squads, nitrogen gas, and the electric chair. These aren't just executions, they're stories of brutal crimes, haunting last words, and controversial justice, and every one of them is scheduled to die before the year ends. Before we get into these haunting final chapters, make sure to hit the subscribe button for more true crime stories and death row case files. Don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Curtis Windham, Florida. Curtis Giovanni Windham's case is one of Florida's longest-running capital punishment stories. In 1992, Windham was convicted of a double homicide in Orange County, Florida. According to court records, Windham fatally shot two men, Kendall Berry and James Garrison, during a violent altercation that prosecutors argued was motivated by a drug-related dispute and financial fallout. Investigators described the crime scene as cold and calculated. Witnesses stated Windham entered the residence armed and opened fire during what appeared to be an ongoing conflict over drugs and money. Both victims were unarmed and killed instantly. The brutal nature of the murders and Windham's criminal history made the case a top priority for local law enforcement at the time. During the trial, prosecutors painted Windham as a dangerous repeat offender with no regard for human life. The jury agreed. In 1994, Windham was sentenced to death for the murders and has been on Florida's death row ever since. Over the next 3 decades, Windham's attorneys launched a series of appeals and post-conviction motions citing ineffective counsel, questions about prosecutorial conduct, and mental health concerns. His case bounced between state and federal courts, but ultimately, each challenge was denied. Despite numerous attempts to get his sentence overturned, Florida's courts upheld the conviction. In 2024, Governor Ron DeSantis signed Windham's death warrant, making him one of several executions scheduled in a year, marked by a dramatic increase in capital punishment activity in the state. Curtis Windham is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on August 28 to 25 at Florida State Prison in Rayford. As of now, no public statements have been issued by his legal team, and Windham has not chosen to give any interviews or media remarks leading up to his execution. Florida uses a 3-drug protocol for executions. 1. Etomidate, a sedative. 2. Rocuronium bromide, a paralytic. 3. Potassium acetate or chloride to stop the heart. This method has come under fire in recent years due to reports of botched executions in other states, but Florida continues to use it as its primary protocol. Windham's execution will mark the first time in over 31 years that justice, as determined by a Florida court in the early 1990s, is carried out in full. His case highlights the glacial pace of America's capital punishment system, where a death sentence may take decades to enforce. If carried out as scheduled, Windham will become Florida's 11th execution since the start of 2023, further cementing the state's aggressive return to capital punishment under its current administration. Kale Barrington Bates. Florida Kale Barrington Bates was convicted of one of the most violent and disturbing home invasion murders in recent Florida memory. The crime occurred in 2007 in Escambia County, when Bates, alongside at least one accomplice, broke into the residence of Michael Frederick Wilson, a 41-year-old man known locally as a quiet and reserved individual. Prosecutors laid out harrowing details during the trial. Wilson was tortured before being killed, suggesting a deeply personal or rage-fueled motive. Evidence presented in court showed that Bates and his co-defendant used blunt force and sharp objects to inflict prolonged pain, leaving Wilson's body with multiple broken bones and defensive wounds. Blood spatter analysis and forensic findings pointed to a sustained assault, not a spontaneous act of violence. Bates was reportedly attempting to rob Wilson, but escalated the crime into what investigators later described as sadistic violence. Neighbors had heard strange noises the night of the murder, but didn't report them until the next day, when Wilson's body was found by a coworker. The brutality of the crime stunned the community and drew statewide attention. Bates was arrested within weeks, thanks to fingerprint evidence and stolen property traced back to him. In 2009, a jury found Bates guilty of first-degree murder, armed burglary, and aggravated battery. The prosecution pursued the death penalty, emphasizing the heinous, atrocious, and cruel nature of the killing. Jurors agreed, recommending a death sentence, which was formally imposed by the judge. Bates showed little emotion during sentencing. His appeals over the years focused on procedural issues and ineffective assistance of counsel, but were repeatedly denied by both state and federal courts. Bates is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on August 19, 2025, at Florida State Prison. This marks another in a rapid series of executions under Governor Ron DeSantis, who has pushed for swift enforcement of capital punishment rulings. Unlike some inmates who make pleas for clemency or issue final public statements, Kale Barrington Bates has remained silent. As of this writing, he has not filed a final appeal or spoken to the media. This silence has left observers wondering whether he has accepted his fate or is simply refusing to participate in what he sees as a predetermined outcome. If executed as scheduled, Bates will be among the first 15 people executed in the U.S. in 2025 and part of Florida's aggressive return to capital punishment. His case, marked by extreme violence and an unrepentant posture, continues to serve as a chilling example of Florida's hardline approach to justice. Ralph Leroy Menses, Utah. Ralph Leroy Menses is scheduled to be executed in Utah on September 5, 2025, for one of the most horrifying crimes the state has ever recorded. In February 1986, Menses abducted 26-year-old Maureen Hunsaker, a mother and telephone operator, from a gas station where she worked in Salt Lake County. According to court documents, Menses lured Maureen under false pretenses. After kidnapping her, he drove her to a remote canyon in Big Cottonwood Canyon, where he bound her hands with electrical wire and tied her to a tree. He then strangled her with that same wire, leaving her body abandoned in the freezing wilderness. She was found days later, half naked, bruised, and dead from asphyxiation. The crime shocked Utah's residents for its cold, methodical execution and sheer cruelty. Prosecutors called it a deliberate, calculated killing, with no chance for the victim to escape. Hunsaker had no known connection to Menses, making the crime appear as a random, predatory attack. Menses was convicted in 1988 and sentenced to death. Over the next 3.5 decades, he remained on Utah's death row, appealing his conviction on numerous grounds, including claims of ineffective counsel and mental illness. His case made headlines again in 2023 when Utah's Attorney General moved to schedule an execution, citing that all reasonable appeals had been exhausted. The state Supreme Court agreed, and the death warrant was signed in early 2025. Ralph Menses chose to be executed by firing squad, a rare and controversial method still legal in Utah under certain conditions. State law permits inmates to opt for the firing squad if lethal injection drugs are unavailable or if the inmate was sentenced before a law change in 2004, as was the case for Menses. The execution will take place in a specially designated chamber at Utah State Prison. The method involves 5 volunteer shooters, one of whose rifles is loaded with a blank round, so no shooter knows who fired the fatal shot. This will be the first firing squad execution in the U.S. since 2010 and Utah's first since Ronnie Lee Gardner in 2010. Menses' choice has reignited fierce national debate about ethics and optics of firing squad executions. Supporters say it is quick and effective, critics call it medieval and barbaric. Advocacy groups have condemned the move, while legal experts point out that Utah is now one of only 3 states with active firing squad laws on the books. At 74 years old, Menses will be Utah's oldest death row inmate to be executed, and his death will mark a chilling historical milestone in American capital punishment. Jeffrey T. West, Alabama. Jeffrey T. West was convicted in connection with the 2002 rape and murder of 29-year-old LaDonna Fields in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The crime sent shockwaves through the community due to its violent nature and the cold-blooded disposal of the victim. According to prosecutors, Fields was abducted outside her apartment complex late at night. She was sexually assaulted, strangled, and left in a wooded area near the Black Warrior River. Her body was discovered several days later. DNA collected at the crime scene, particularly from beneath the victim's fingernails and her clothing, was used to link Jeffrey West to the attack. West was arrested in 2004 after a DNA database match, and during his trial in 2006, forensic experts testified that the DNA evidence was a near-certain match. Despite maintaining his innocence from the start, West was convicted of capital murder with a sexual assault enhancement and sentenced to death. Over the past 2 decades, West's attorneys have filed multiple appeals, arguing that his confession was coerced, that the DNA evidence had limitations, and that his trial counsel failed to challenge key parts of the prosecution's case. However, every appeal was denied, with the courts ruling that the evidence was overwhelming and the trial had been fair. In 2025, Alabama's governor signed West's death warrant, making him the second inmate scheduled to die by nitrogen hypoxia, a controversial and relatively untested execution method. On September 25, 2025, Jeffrey T. West is scheduled to be executed via nitrogen hypoxia, a method in which the inmate is forced to breathe pure nitrogen, leading to oxygen deprivation and death by asphyxiation. This method was first used in January 2024 when Alabama executed Kenneth Eugene Smith, marking the first time nitrogen gas had ever been used in a U.S. execution. While Alabama officials called it painless and efficient, witnesses described Smith convulsing for several minutes, reigniting ethical concerns over whether this method is truly humane. In West's case, he has not publicly commented on the method of execution or filed any specific objections to it. As such, he is set to become only the second person in U.S. history executed by nitrogen gas, making his case both historically significant and deeply controversial. While Alabama touts nitrogen hypoxia as a backup method for when lethal injection drugs are unavailable or legally challenged, West's execution is likely to draw national scrutiny, especially in light of the unsettling observations during the first attempt in 2024. Death penalty opponents argue that using this method without thorough scientific study amounts to human experimentation, while others see it as a more palatable alternative to lethal injection. If carried out as scheduled, Jeffrey T. West's execution will further test the boundaries of modern execution protocols in the U.S., possibly influencing how other states handle death sentences in the years to come. Blaine Milm. Texas Blaine Milm was convicted for one of the most horrifying child abuse cases in Texas history, the 2008 torture and murder of 13-month-old Amora Carson, the daughter of his then-girlfriend Jessica Carson. What prosecutors later described as a savage killing took place in Rusk County, and the motive was as disturbing as the act itself, a failed exorcism. According to trial testimony, Milm and Carson believed the toddler was possessed by a demon. In an attempt to drive it out, they subjected the child to extreme physical abuse over a span of several hours. Amora suffered crushing injuries to her head and chest, bite marks, torn ligaments, and broken bones, injuries described by a medical examiner as worse than anything seen in decades of forensic work. When emergency services arrived, Amora was already dead. The couple initially tried to claim the child had been injured during a seizure, but the forensic evidence overwhelmingly contradicted their story. In 2010, Milm was sentenced to death after being found guilty of capital murder. His girlfriend and co-defendant, Jessica Carson, was also convicted but received a life sentence. The trial painted Milm as the dominant figure in the couple, with prosecutors arguing that he used religion as a cover for his violent tendencies. The jury agreed, and the judge handed down the ultimate penalty. But over the years, Milm's case grew increasingly controversial, not because of the facts of the crime, but because of his mental health status and the science used to convict him. Milm's defense team later presented evidence of severe intellectual disability and mental illness, arguing that he was incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. They also challenged the reliability of the forensic bite mark analysis that played a key role in the original trial, citing evolving standards in forensic science that now consider bite mark evidence to be unreliable and potentially misleading. Despite these claims, multiple courts upheld his conviction and sentence. Appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court were denied, and Texas issued his execution date for September 25, 2025. Milm is set to be executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas, a facility known as the busiest execution site in the United States. Unless a last-minute stay is granted, he will be among the most high-profile executions of the year. Texas uses a single drug protocol, pentobarbital, for executions, considered more reliable than the multi-drug combinations used in other states. However, lethal injection itself remains under legal and ethical scrutiny nationwide. What makes Milm's case especially disturbing is how it has been framed at the intersection of mental illness, junk science, and extreme violence. Advocacy groups have called for clemency, not to excuse the crime, but to highlight how flawed expert testimony and untreated mental health conditions may have played a role in this devastating outcome. Still, with the appeals exhausted and the state standing firm, Blaine Milm is set to be executed on September 25th, the same day as Jeffrey T. West in Alabama. 2 men, 2 states, 2 radically different methods of execution. Roy Lee Ward. Indiana Roy Lee Ward was convicted for the 2001 murder of 15-year-old Stacy Payne in the small community of Tell City, Indiana. The case became one of the most high-profile criminal trials in the state's modern history due to the shocking nature of the crime and the age of the victim. According to court records, Ward unlawfully entered the Payne home on July 11, 2001, while the teenager was home alone. Prosecutors stated that the attack was premeditated and violent, and evidence presented during the trial, including DNA and a taped confession, led to a swift conviction. Ward was arrested the same day and charged with multiple felony counts, including capital murder. The case deeply affected the community, prompting public discussions on parole procedures, as Ward had a prior criminal history and was not incarcerated at the time of the attack. Ward's initial death sentence was handed down in 2002, but the legal battle didn't end there. Over the next 2 decades, he and his defense team pursued numerous appeals at both the state and federal level. One of the central claims involved intellectual disability, with defense attorneys arguing that Ward's cognitive limitations made him ineligible for capital punishment under the U.S. Supreme Court's Atkins v. Virginia ruling. They submitted IQ assessments and records of developmental challenges in support of this claim. Despite these arguments, Indiana courts repeatedly upheld the conviction and sentence, stating that Ward did not meet the legal criteria for intellectual disability as defined by both state and federal standards. As of now, Indiana has not publicly confirmed which method will be used to carry out Roy Lee Ward's execution. The state's default method remains lethal injection, but Indiana has not conducted an execution since 2009 due to issues securing the necessary drugs. If the execution proceeds as scheduled on October 10, 2025, it would mark Indiana's first use of the death penalty in over 15 years. There has been public speculation about whether the state will resume executions through traditional means or consider emerging alternatives, but no official announcement has been made. Ward's case became a long-running example of the legal complexities surrounding death penalty cases, especially where questions of mental health are concerned. His attorneys have maintained that executing someone with significant intellectual and developmental challenges is morally and legally inappropriate. However, after years of litigation, Indiana's courts ultimately ruled that he was competent to stand trial and eligible for capital punishment. If carried out, his execution would likely reignite debate over the ethical boundaries of the death penalty, especially in states like Indiana, where executions have been on hold for over a decade. Lance C. Shockley, Missouri. Lance C. Shockley was sentenced to death for the 2005 ambush and murder of Missouri Highway Patrol Sergeant Carl DeGraff, a 15-year law enforcement veteran. The murder took place in Shannon County, a quiet rural area, and quickly escalated into a high-profile case due to the deliberate targeting of a police officer. According to investigators, Shockley, then under investigation for a separate fatal crash, lured Sashanade DeGraff to a remote location and shot him at close range with a shotgun. The motive appeared to be an attempt to eliminate a key witness and halt the criminal investigation against him. Prosecutors argued that the murder was premeditated and designed to obstruct justice, describing it as a cold and calculated execution of a public servant doing his job. DeGraff had reportedly been building a case against Shockley involving vehicular manslaughter charges from an earlier incident. The killing sent shockwaves through Missouri's law enforcement community, prompting a massive manhunt and widespread media coverage. Shockley was arrested shortly afterward and charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action. Shockley's trial began in 2007 and ended with a conviction and death sentence. Jurors took into account the targeted nature of the crime, the victim's role as a police officer, and the potential for obstruction of justice, all of which qualified as aggravating factors under Missouri law. For nearly 2 decades, Shockley has remained on Missouri's death row, filing multiple appeals in both state and federal courts. His legal team raised issues related to jury selection, mental health assessments, and alleged misconduct, but none of the appeals were successful in overturning his conviction or sentence. In early 2025, Missouri's Supreme Court denied his final petition for post-conviction relief, clearing the way for his execution. The method of execution has not yet been officially disclosed, but Missouri traditionally uses lethal injection. The state has an active protocol and a history of carrying out executions swiftly once all legal avenues are exhausted. If carried out as scheduled on October 14, 2025, Shockley's execution would likely occur at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic, and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, the site of the state's modern executions. What makes this case particularly significant is that Shockley targeted a law enforcement officer to obstruct justice, a rare and especially aggravating factor in death penalty cases. Prosecutors called it a direct attack on the criminal justice system. Senator DeGraff was remembered by colleagues as a dedicated public servant, and his name is engraved on law enforcement memorials across the country. The long delay in carrying out the sentence has been a point of frustration for DeGraff's family, who have spoken out in favor of final closure. With nearly 20 years on death row, Lance Shockley's case underscores the slow-moving nature of capital punishment in America, where even the most clear-cut convictions often face decades of appeals before reaching their final conclusion. Robert Robertson, Texas. Robert Robertson was sentenced to death for the 2002 death of his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki Curtis, in Palestine, Texas. Prosecutors claimed that Robertson violently shook the child, causing fatal brain injuries consistent with what was then known as shaken baby syndrome, SBS. According to trial records, Robertson brought his daughter to the emergency room after she became unresponsive at home. Doctors observed signs of brain swelling and internal bleeding, symptoms that, at the time, were considered hallmark indicators of abuse under the SBS model. Based largely on those findings and the child's injuries, Robertson was charged with capital murder and convicted in 2003. The prosecution argued that Robertson lost his temper and shook the toddler, causing fatal head trauma. However, Robertson has consistently maintained his innocence, insisting that Nikki had been ill in the days leading up to her death and may have suffered from a seizure or an undiagnosed medical condition, such as pneumonia or a previous fall. Robertson's case has drawn national and international attention due to the growing medical and legal skepticism surrounding shaken baby syndrome. In the years following his conviction, numerous medical experts and forensic scientists have challenged the validity of SBS diagnoses, noting that the triad of symptoms once thought to prove abuse can also occur due to natural causes, infections, or accidental trauma. Robertson's legal team argues that outdated science and inadequate legal defense led to a wrongful conviction. In 2016, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals granted a stay of execution to review new medical evidence, but in 2023, that court ruled that Robertson's conviction should stand, clearing the way for an execution date. His attorneys have since appealed to the federal courts, arguing that executing someone based on now discredited science is a violation of due process. Robert Robertson is scheduled to be executed on October 16, 2025, by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas, the state's primary execution facility. Texas uses a single drug protocol, pentobarbital, and barring a last-minute stay, Robertson's execution would proceed as the state's 12th of the year, continuing a record-breaking pace under Texas's capital punishment system. Robertson's case has become a flashpoint in the debate over forensic science and wrongful convictions. Organizations like the Innocence Project and Death Penalty Information Center have cited his case as an example of how courts sometimes rely on outdated or flawed medical theories in capital cases. If the execution goes forward, critics say it could represent a serious miscarriage of justice, while supporters of the original verdict argue that multiple courts have upheld the conviction even after reviewing new medical evidence. Whatever the outcome, Robert Robertson's execution will remain one of the most controversial capital cases of 2025, highlighting the tension between evolving science and final justice. Harold Wayne Nichols, Tennessee. Harold Wayne Nichols was convicted for the 1988 rape and murder of 21-year-old Karen Pulley in Chattanooga, Tennessee. According to investigators, Nichols broke into Pulley's apartment late at night and attacked her while she was alone. The assault ended in her death, and her body was discovered by family members the next day. The crime shocked the community. Pulley was known as a kind and devout young woman, and her brutal death sparked widespread outrage. A forensic investigation quickly led to Nichols' arrest. DNA and physical evidence placed him at the scene, and he later confessed during questioning. Nichols had a prior criminal record, including a history of sexual offenses, which the prosecution used to establish a pattern of violent behavior. He was convicted of first-degree murder, rape, and aggravated burglary and sentenced to death in 1990. Although Nichols has been on Tennessee's death row for over 30 years, his execution has been delayed multiple times due to legal challenges, clemency petitions, and changes in execution protocols. His legal team has argued that Tennessee's lethal injection process is unconstitutional, citing concerns about pain and suffering, and they've pushed for further medical reviews of his physical and mental health. The state's protocol was also suspended in 2022 after it was discovered that officials had not properly tested the drugs used for executions, prompting a temporary moratorium. In 2023, Tennessee resumed setting execution dates after overhauling its protocol and legal procedures. Nichols' execution was initially scheduled for June 2023, then delayed again, and is now officially set for December 11, 2025. Tennessee remains one of the few states that offers inmates a choice between lethal injection and the electric chair. Nichols, however, has not publicly declared a method, meaning lethal injection will be the default method unless he files a written request for electrocution. The state's electric chair, known as Old Sparky, has been used in several executions in recent years, most notably in 2019 and 2020. Critics argue that both execution methods pose ethical issues, while supporters say offering a choice increases transparency and inmate autonomy. Harold Nichols' case represents the intersection of prolonged death row incarceration and shifting legal standards. He's one of the longest-serving death row inmates in Tennessee history, and his name has appeared on multiple execution calendars over the past decade, only to be delayed each time. If the December 11, 2025 execution proceeds as scheduled, Nichols will become one of the final U.S. executions of the year, closing a chapter on a case that has spanned nearly 4 decades and symbolized the slow grind of the American capital punishment system. These scheduled executions reveal a justice system walking the tightrope between retribution and reform. As lethal injections continue, firing squads and nitrogen gas are bringing back older, and some say crueler methods. With each name on this list, we're reminded of the weighty decisions courts, governors, and victims' families must bear. If you found this video informative, hit that subscribe button for more raw and real death row case files. Smash the like button if you want more in-depth coverage of upcoming executions. And tell us in the comments, which of these cases shocked you the most?